Good morning, everyone. Now we're up to the point of access, the whole point of UK Biobank. All of the compiling of data, the recruitment, all the data cleaning, the worrying about protection of data, trying to figure out what data duty of care means. We still don't know that. Lots of issues still up in the air, but UK Biobank is clearly up and running. I very much enjoyed yesterday and felt some real nostalgia having been involved since just about the beginning of this saga. And I think it's really going very well and about on timeline. I won one wager saying it would take 10 years, and here we are. Just a few words by me about myself. My identification in the program is consultant, which sounds like I'm sort of undercover agent for something. I'm a retired academic, started in organic chemistry and biochemistry, eventually moved my career, long story, to working on these kinds of issues. Been thinking about them for the last years, was commissioned a few years ago, probably 5 years ago, by MRC and Wellcome to write a report on access. I talked to many of you during that process, and happy to say some of the recommendations were followed, others have been worked around in various other ways. And obviously the organizers asked me to chair because of my interest in access, and also so if I'm chairing I won't be blurting out from the floor all the time. Just a few words since I have the podium. Access is a very tricky issue. It means a lot of things. It includes the first issue, access by whom? Access to what? Is it to data? What kinds of data? Or to samples as well, or to only samples? Small amounts of data just for controls or a big deal project. Under what conditions? At the end of yesterday, when we're all getting tired, there was some discussion of whether controlled access is right. I prefer conditional access because they are conditions. That's not bad or good, they're just conditions like in a lot of life. And so the conditional access is what's involved here. So to whom and so on. For what purposes? Well, this may sound simple, but it can be either for fundamental academic purposes, or it can be for, God forsake, in the UK, commercial purposes. But we tend to forget that universities are pretty commercial these days with respect to intellectual property, and even with regard to assessing the importance of departments' work and so on. And the bringing in of money matters to most organizations. So you have to be very careful with the idea of commercial purposes, also with military purposes. I blurted out at a conference not too long ago that even military research covers all sorts of things, including some of the best burn research in the world is done by the world's military, and they publish it. It's terrific research. This is an enormous problem for every military in the world. They have very good medical research access of their own scientists and so on. So for what purposes? How are the various risks to be assessed? There are conditions, and one is risk of re-identification. That's very tricky. I've worked on identifiability for some years, and it's very difficult and becoming even harder to say, oh, no, nobody could re-identify these people. Everyone knows that, but it's an issue we simply can't forget. And I don't know how committees can assess that. How to deal with exceptional issues, such as a request to recontact people. That's a common thing in science. How about a request to send data on to colleagues? I mean, one thing scientists do is pass data and samples on. I did that. Science is one of the most communal efforts that humans have ever devised. And so you say, well, I have this colleague. Well, she doesn't have formal permission, but she does very good work in parallel with us in this other university that happens to be in China. So we'll just send her some things. So how do access committees know whether this ever happens? Probably don't really know. And then overall the question is, how will what I call the chain of trust be maintained from people who enroll, who entrust the funders and UK Biobank organization and EGC and so on to those out there. So how is the chain of trust? This is fundamentally what's involved at the access point. We talked yesterday about possible penalties for violations, so on. That's another subject. Today we're really going to focus on responsibilities of access committees, and in particular the EGC. Word access came up 100 times yesterday, so we've set the ground for it. Today we have three experienced speakers. We'll start with Martin Bobrow. Professor Bobrow has chaired many access committees. He's probably forgotten how many, and a distinguished career in ethics at several universities, sort of retired, I guess, from University of Cambridge. We have next Jonathan Sellers, who is the legal counsel to UK Biobank, and is sitting in today, not for Rory, but he probably knows more about this than Sir Rory does. So Jonathan will talk about this from Biobank's managerial operational point of view, and then Schoenholm, very experienced philosopher, both, if I may put it, theoretical philosophy, and also very applied. He's served on many committees with distinction, so that's the order in which we will take things. If I may then introduce Professor Bobrow. Martin is the only one who said he has trouble staying on time, no sense of time, so he will forgive me if I look edgy at some point.
Well, I won't forgive you if you don't. So, thank you, Bill. I was a medical geneticist before I retired, so I come at this all from a slightly different angle. In addition to having chaired only three access committees, I am also currently the chair of a thing called EAGDA, and I need to say that because it's of some interest in terms of what I'm going to say. This is an expert advisory group on data access. It has been set up by 4 big UK funding agencies to advise them. It's not a very outward-facing body, and it's specifically advising them on growing issues and governance matters in relation to data access. So the IAGDA has an excellent secretariat, Catherine Littler, who spoke yesterday, Natalie Banner, Dave Carr, and a really stellar group of members, and I'm greatly indebted to all of them. IAGDA is busy looking at issues of data access across the board at the moment, but has not got a draft paper and has not made any decisions, so I'm not talking for them at all. I'm talking for myself only, and I won't be held to account for anything I say, which is where I like to come from. I just acknowledge the facts. So I'm going to look at this firstly as general background. I don't actually know a lot about biobank access other than what I can read, and we'll hear about that later from Jonathan. First question, I think, is what do we mean by data sharing? And I guess what I mean is that it's a matter of allowing large data sets to be readily accessible to all sorts of people with scientific aims who have had nothing to do with the generation of the data, who may have questions of a sort which are entirely different from those for which the data collection was designed, and to let them in because, well, in the narrow sense, because all of the funding agencies, pretty well the big ones all internationally now, have policies which mandate relatively open data access long pre-publication for very large data sets. The reason they do that is that the data sets that are being created now are really far too big for any one group to be able to seriously mine and exhaust on their own. So it's efficient from a funder's point of view, but it's also, in my view, an imperative from the point of view of the people who are the subjects of the data, because the reason most people volunteer for research is that they want to find out more about health and disease, not they want to further the career of researcher X. I'm sure they want to do both, but the emphasis is on output rather than on the mechanics. Scientists, for very good reason, see this rather differently. There's a long tradition of people putting a lot of investment into creating these structures and wanting to see their personal return in terms of career advancement, in terms of fame, fortune, and so forth. And that's all entirely legitimate. So I'm putting it that way because I think this is an area which is developing rather than developed, which is sensitive because there are conflicting rights, and there are rights on the researcher's side as well as everyone else's sides. And they need to be balanced and negotiated with some tact, some skill, and a bit of time. So that's the background. The general overview of the field, mostly from the UK, but not entirely, is that there's actually very little resistance to the principles of what I've said. Pretty well everyone signs up to the idea that sharing data in that sense is a good idea. In practice, and we've done rather a lot of talking to people who want to use data rather than people who generate data. It's not always very well planned, it's not always audited, and it is certainly not always sensibly resourced. In fact, Biobank's probably an exception. It's hardly ever properly resourced. Access procedures can be bureaucratic, time-consuming, repetitive, and there's a general feeling that the level of process is sometimes disproportionate. Now, none of this is grotesque, and taken one study at a time, it sort of works. But the viewpoint of most, well, hang on, I'm getting out of line here. Let me go on to the next thing. So what are the features of a decent data management system? If you speak to people who are secondary researchers, they would firstly like the existence and characteristics of that data set to be readily discoverable. That is not a problem for UK Biobank, a giant thing with a huge shadow. It is a major problem with many, many smaller but quite big and expensive studies. People just don't know where the data are unless they happen to know about it. So it's all word of mouth and a bit of publication and so forth. They want the data to be good. They want reasonable help in understanding the data. And that is a problem, because the people who do the studies really understand their data, and people coming in from outside sometimes need quite a lot of help to understand its strengths and weaknesses, and it's all very well to ask for it, but providing it costs time and energy. They want facility and transparency of access, not unreasonable, fair conditions, transparent, independent appeal process, an absolute rarity in this field. Sounds straightforward, seldom used, but it's nice to see it. So what's happened in practice? Pretty well all of the bigger studies land up setting up some sort of data access committee, because how else would you do it? People write to you saying, I demand to see, or I would like to see, and someone has to make decisions. And you set up a little process and you appoint some form of management committee, a huge variety. This ranges from the PI, him or herself, saying, I like that person, I don't like that person, I parody slightly, to much more formal and regulated structures with which you're all familiar. The issues that those groups address, the ones that do it seriously, are actually surprisingly, not surprisingly, they are quite standardized. So they want to know, is this a genuine bona fide researcher in front of me? Easier to ask sometimes than to answer. They want to know who is going to take responsibility if this person does something outside the contract that we make. So who takes responsibility? So someone who comes in from a very distant country with a Hotmail address and no obvious institutional affiliation looks mildly riskier than someone who comes from down the road with a name that everyone recognizes. Is the project that they're proposing acceptable? Is what they're doing going to conform to the consent under which the samples were collected, the data were collected? What is the risk of re-identifying the subject either deliberately or accidentally? So this has become a very big deal, particularly in genomics, as the realization has dawned over the last 4 or 5 years that where you start linking big and rich data sets from very different sources, electoral rolls with health records, with genomic data sets, you can do some quite surprising and scary things. I'd have to say as a footnote that most of that stuff so far has only been shown to be an issue under really quite specific, detailed and unusual circumstances, but that doesn't mean you can turn your back on it. It has to be thought of quite explicitly. Is there any conflict with the legitimate scientific ambitions of the group who've spent the past 10 years collecting the data? And then there are other ethical and reputational issues. Are they going to bring the study into disrepute? What about commercial issues that Bill's already referred to? So that's the sort of list, and that's pretty well the whole list that are considered by these groups as they try to adjudicate on each decision. So how does it work in practice? The user's view is that they sometimes find application processes over-complex. So this is a matter of proportionality. It depends what you're asking. I think the point that needs to be borne in mind, 2 points. Firstly, this has been an almost entirely provider-driven market up to now. Who sets up data access processes? The people who generate the data. Who speaks for the people who are the purchasers, in quotes, of those data, the users? Well, nobody. Nobody's actually thought about their point of view much at all. So that's the direction that we're coming from. What's it look like from their point of view? The one thing that's really clear is that each application process in itself may be reasonable. If you need to do it 25 different times to go to access 20 different data sets, and they were all asking the same questions on slightly different forms in slightly different ways, round and round and round, you get into a very well-known situation which our local research ethics committees were tied up in for several decades, and we could go the same way if we didn't get some kind of reasonable coordination into the system. So far, nobody has monitored this. We asked our 4 big funding agencies, how many DACs are there and how do they operate? And the answer was, well, you better go and find out. I mean, this is just, it's virgin territory. So repetitive access, disproportionate expectations of scientific merit. So it's reasonable to ask, is this a totally stupid thing? The question is how high the bar should be. Let me be very clear. As soon as you move on to depletable resources, so depletable resources are like samples which will get used up. They're like recontacting, where the patience of the people being recontacted is depletable. Then scientific merit is absolutely critical because you have to ration how the stuff will be used, and when it's gone, it's gone. If you're just accessing data totally anonymized in a safe way, does it matter much whether this is good science that you would fund? My view is that the question is this dangerous rather than, is this good? And if it's not dangerous, then the default should be that you allow access. I think a polite and decent thing to do is to point out to the applicant that this is stupid for the following reasons, and perhaps introduce them to someone who could help them understand it better. But in the end, provided they're not asking undue effort on anyone's part and not doing anything hazardous, I think the default is you should let it go with a low bar. Same thing goes for expectations of researcher experience, but remember that they have to be trustworthy and accountable. Overdominance of the data generating team, who clearly have a potential conflict of interest because they would like to mine it all till the cows come home. Most people try to behave very well. There are occasional exceptions, and there is one that is awkward. There are still quite a number of sets of data that can only be accessed if you agree that any publication will be by collaboration with one or more members of the team who generated the data. Now, it's easy to understand how that comes about, but to me the question is, it's essentially one of scientific publishing ethic, and that is, has there been a proper intellectual contribution to the study from the people who want their names on it, or are they simply sticking their names on it because it was their data that they collected 10 years ago, in which case I would put them slightly in the category of senior professors in some European countries some time ago who automatically had their name on every paper that came out of their department, no matter what. And that's generally, I think, nowadays thought to be a tad old-fashioned. So those are the kinds of rather niggly little things that come up in these discussions. I think, sort of penultimately, over and above issues that are under the control of the data holders themselves, there are some system issues here. So all funders ask big studies of this sort for a data management plan as part of the funding application. Very sensible. How many of them ever go back to monitor whether that plan has been put into operation? Well, I couldn't possibly say, but it's fewer than the number of committees I've chaired in this area. There is one. are those plans, which are sometimes quite explicitly drawn up, are they explicitly funded? No, generally they're not. So the peer review system isn't taking this as seriously as either the policymakers or the people who are actually generating the data sets. So all of that needs to be kind of tidied up. It needs to, if it's going to be taken seriously, it needs to be explicitly funded to a reasonable degree. You don't want to create a new bureaucracy, but you do want to be sure that it isn't a serious, unorganized burden. You do want to audit what's going on in a light sort of way so that you know if there are gross breaches. And you do definitely want to support the people who do it. There's a whole piece of work on incentives for data sharing to do with scientific career progression, to do with hefty funding formula, the university funding formulas, to do with the way scientific institutions value data managers. There's a raft of stuff there which needs to just jerk into line with this whole movement. And we have to recognize that releasing data costs money, and there are really only two ways that comes. It either comes out of the budget that's given to them, or they go for cost recovery. And, you know, I'm pretty agnostic myself, but I think it's one or the other, and there's no point kidding ourselves that there is a third magic way. So, my overview, I think there is good evidence, there's even some published literature now, that most people who are generating big data sets believe this is the right thing to do. I don't think there's any reason to believe that sharing data under current circumstances is creating significant risks for research participants that haven't been made explicit and controlled for. Need to keep an eye on it. But the process as a whole is still pretty clunky. It's highly dependent on occasions on goodwill. There are lots of opportunities for convergence and consolidation. That applies particularly, of course, to smaller studies. So Biobank is way off at one end of the spectrum. But I think that that also means that the very big studies, like Biobank, like one or two others that I know of, ICGC, the International Cancer Genome Consortium is another, these very big, very well-organized studies need to set an example and provide leadership in the field as well, and try to help some of the other things to, you know, get to move towards a more coherent overall system. And I think it all needs to be transparent, because I think good transparent governance helps science in general account for itself properly to the public who support us. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you, Chairman. Did I blow my tide?